This is Season 2, Episode 13 of Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast all about upping your game. Doesn't matter if you're a game master or a player, you'll find advice, ideas, and some strong opinions. Our episode tonight is Running a Horror RPG, or Ruh-roh, Shaggy. Hey everyone, like I said, welcome to Mastering the RPG, tabletop RPG podcast with advice, cool stuff found, opinions, and just generally having a good time. I'm Carl with my co-host Eric and James, and you'll find information about the show at masteringtherepg.com, and you can send us email, feedback, questions, whatever at gamemaster@masteringtherepg.com. So hey, it's good to have everybody back on the mic again. How are you guys doing? James, how are you doing?
I'm going great, Scoob. How are you? Sorry, it was just... It's a great voice.
Surprised.
I nailed it. I nailed it.
Totally nailed it. What was our first ever episode? How to do convincing accents? I think there's a masterclass right there, everyone. I'm going really well. A bit of a break for us. We're on school vacation at the moment, so a few less school games at the moment, but still doing plenty of role-playing. Started a couple of new players who are some of our listeners. Are playing in one of our games, one of my games, on a Monday night. So they're welcome to the middle-aged marauders, the group of 40 to 50-year-old blokes that I play with every second Monday. And I'm starting to play in a new Planescape campaign on Friday night. So I'm very excited. So Planescape comes out officially later this year by Wizards of the Coast, but we're getting in early, and so we're running a kind of converted second edition D&D Planescape game, which is very exciting. I loved the last game that I played in, even though I do a lot of dungeon mastering. I really think there's great value in playing in other people's games. So we did a level 1 to level 20 campaign that wound up after 3 years earlier this year, and so it's really good to get into a new campaign. I'm a bit stoked, bit excited. It's going to be great. How about you, Eric? How are you traveling at the moment?
I'm doing all right. A lot of stuff shuffling around at home. Not too much stuff going on the game front. Just kind of playing the same games I'm in. Still, my settings taking a little bit of a back seat, but I think next month I'll be able to get and kind of finish it finally, so I can get my own game going at last. But yeah, not much to report at this moment.
Myself, well, Eric, you forgot all about. We did a big 3-part series on arcane backgrounds and powers for Savage Worlds.
Yeah,
Fantasy
true.
Companion. I mean, we were talking each episode over an hour of content, hour and a half. They went on and on. A lot of really good stuff. Got some good comments on it. So he was doing himself a disservice. He did a ton of research for those and for that particular video series on Tabletop Tango. So it was good stuff. That was a lot of fun to do, and the game is going well as well. Players, I think, are probably feeling they're like a step behind the forces at work, trying to catch up and get ahead of them.
Yeah. Good stuff.
But we'll see. I don't know if Eric feels that, but I definitely felt like the guys were like, "Oh, we just missed it." Oh, you know.
Yeah.
All right.
Tell me more about the steps. That's what I want to know. I want to know more specifically what steps are we behind.
Okay, that I can't tell you.
All right. Okay.
All right. Well, hey, we don't have a cool stuff for this week, so we might as well jump right into the main topic of running a horror game.
Mastering the RPG with Carl, Eric, and James. Yeah.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the main topic. Running a horror RPG. And Eric has volunteered to take us through the outline tonight, and so that's very nice of him. I appreciate that.
Well,
and I'm going to turn it on over to you, Eric.
Yeah, I volunteered because I would say this is my biggest blind spot as far as storytelling. I mean, I've watched some horror shows and movies, but I'm not that scared of it. I'm just not really into the genre that much, and I've never actually played like a real horror game, neither or ran one, and I haven't really even watched. I mean, besides like Vampire the Masquerade, which I don't consider really that horror either. Anyways, so
that's horror.
Is it horror?
That's
I
horror.
don't know, but you're the monster, right?
Totally.
I played games where I'm the monster. So to me, that doesn't feel like horror. But let's talk about it then. So let's specifically. Okay, let's bring it up now. What is horror? I think James, what do you consider horror?
Oh, good Lord.
Yeah.
I was hoping I wasn't going to get this question.
You're getting
What is horror? Horror is a genre of games and literature where it is pushing the boundaries of good taste, pushing the boundaries of shock. It's pushing the boundaries of what a mere mortal can withstand. It is fear. It is terror. It is the morbidity of death.
Wow.
It's all sorts of things to all sorts of people. And I freaking love it. I love running horror games. It's one of my favorite things. And yes, Vampire the Masquerade is a horror game. Vampire the Masquerade and the slide and the slide into vampirism and the slow release of letting go of your humanity is an existential horror that shouldn't be underestimated. It's a great horror game.
All right.
Horror is everything to all people. I don't know. What's a good definition of horror, Carl? Someone Google it.
I think that is one thing I didn't research. But for me, a horror is anything that really causes a severe uneasiness in your soul, or that fear. It's not just fear. It's that I don't know how else to say it. You're just uneasy. You feel something's out
not
of sorts.
Right. Yeah, it's not right.
Yeah,
I mean,
just something's not right.
To me, the one
Anything
word that came out
causes that.
The big word that is tension. Like, at least for a game, right? Is like creating tension. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Yeah, tension is part of it.
Unease
for sure.
is good.
Yeah. Being uneasy, just having your skin crawl, what have you. To me, horror is more than just. Well, we should talk about that. What we think different ways of doing horror is.
Yeah,
that's kind of the point, right? So
yeah, we'll talk about that.
But there's different types of horror, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's
exactly.
There's kind of zombie splat, brains everywhere horror, and then there's more subtle forms of horror, I guess you could say.
Well, what are the main forms of horror you think for games, or what works? What's the main forms of horror that works best for tabletop games, like specifically? Because that's what we're here to talk about. Carl, what are the types that you like to use the most?
Well, there's kind of like three, and I know that the way people do films and genres, they cut them in different ways, but I really think of it. There's three really good ones that play well in the tabletop role playing. First is that what might be called cosmic. That's the Call of Cthulhu, right? That's the
James
unknowable. Horrors are at a scale that the human mind just can't possibly comprehend without going insane. The second one is kind of a gothic horror. This is, classic, the monsters that cause us unease. We don't know about them. We don't understand them. It has that vibe of Victorian Europe, and that dark and dreadful and dreary. And then the last is, I kind of mash them together, is that action, pulpy, kind of that modern where. And I forgot. I take slasher, and I don't think slasher is a great kind of RPG-ish one. But things like the zombie movies fall into this. The Creature from the Black Lagoon, those kinds of things that are really out there that you just don't understand. So those are the three kind of main ones that I think of that work really well in a game setting where you're playing. Yeah. Not a monster, because there's a whole set of horror like you were talking about where you play a monster.
Yeah, which I have played a lot. I'm thinking more
Monster Hearts.
I've played things like that. I've played plenty of times. I've been a werewolf or a creature, but I don't. To me, that doesn't read as horror, because I personally am not. I'm the thing causing terror.
You are the
I'm
horror.
Not under. Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah. But James, do you have any other ones that you? You're obviously the cosmic horror guy, but. Do you split that up any differently?
Yeah, but I've played a lot of Gothic as well. So the cosmic horror, that eldritch, unknowable horror that is riddled through Lovecraft's and Poe's writing that kind of deals with a lot of that unknowable. The Gothic horror, I think, does fit into the "you are a monster" idea, because if you think about the real classic Gothic novels of Dracula and of Frankenstein, that it places a lot of the empathy onto the monster in each of those books, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That kind of vibe is very heavy in the Gothic genre, and so that, I think, that actually does translate quite well into games. And Gothic for me is equally as I love it just as much as the cosmic horror. The Curse of Strahd's come out of there, real classic kind of role playing. Dungeons and Dragons tends to lend itself better to Gothic horror than it does to cosmic horror. So I think for most people, when they're going down that path of introducing horror into their role playing games, if you're trying to introduce it into a fantasy setting, Gothic works very, very well, far more than possibly the cosmic horror. The action monster of the week pulp kind of vibe thing, though, is a hell of a lot of fun to play. I run a pulp Cthulhu game of Masks of Nyarlathotep once a month, and pretty much every game convention that I run is a pulp kind of the Mummy, that kind of macabre circus kind of vibe, which makes for really good one shots, really fun games. And so I think they're all great. They've all got their own place, and in a lot of ways, a lot of it's just about the pacing, about how those games translate. It's about the pacing and the mood that you set can really lend itself well to this eldritch horror or Gothic, or the fast action of pulp and the splatter fest of zombie killing that you can get out of a really good pulp game.
So I mean, you've pretty much said it, but let's talk about here. Like, what are your guys' experiences with running horror, playing horror? I mean, James, we know. I mean, you said. Is there any other things you want to kind of bring up here?
I would like to mention World of Darkness. I've talked a lot about my Call of Cthulhu, and I've talked a lot about Strahd and D&D and things like that. But in my mind, I actually learned a hell of a lot about role-playing horror games through the 90s and the 2000s playing World of Darkness games. Vampire the Masquerade is a fantastic game for that romantic side to the Gothicness of horror. And it is a really good game to get into the role-playing of what it means to be a monster and what it means to have monstrous things happen around you. That slipping of your control so that you're no longer human, that kind of release and that horror of not being able to look yourself in the mirror is a really good system to role play some of that stuff, and it's really quite adult in its content in terms of role playing games, and not for everyone. But that's one thing that I learned a lot about when I was running World of Warcraft. God help me, World of Darkness games. Is it has a far more adult approach to it and a far more nuanced approach to how you deal with the horror of the mind.
It really challenges you, right?
Like
it really challenges your preconceived notions, really challenges things that we don't want to think about. I think that's, which in a way makes you uncomfortable. Yeah. I like that. Yeah.
And I guess when we're talking about horror, is that kind of the things that make you icky. Yeah. A lot of these games put you in the position where you are doing icky things that makes your skin crawl. It really creates that definite discomfort about what situations that you're in and what the limits of where you would go morally. Makes it a really interesting role-playing experience.
Where it's not just like you're being scared. It's these things are challenging me, and it puts me in a weird space. Carl, what about you? What is your kind of main experiences as far as running or playing?
But the funny thing is, when we were playing back in the day with AD&D, we were doing horror with AD&D, and Vampire was that game for those other people. At the time we were like, oh, that's those other people play that game. And
women.
yeah, exactly. and so we used D&D rules, and I think AD&D lended itself a little bit more as long as you didn't do the power curve and you kept the characters weak and you brought on, you didn't let the creatures in a monster manual guide. You could create that vibe, and we did a lot of that at that time, just trying to make things scary, because we were kind of over for a while let's all get up to 15th level and just go killing things left, right, up, and down. We were really looking forward to something that we had a little more and I'll say uneasiness again. I mean, I wanted to feel icky, I guess is the word you say. I wanted to have that feeling of uneasiness. I'm not a big horror movie fan either, but it's nice to, to have a little, knot in your stomach while you're playing. It really gets you, and it really gets kind of those bloods flowing in a way that I run up against a monster and I just slash it with my sword, which is a whole different feeling. Another game that I played a little bit was Delta Green, which has a completely different side of it. You are supposedly competent, strong individuals going against this cosmic horror out there that you're trying to protect the world about. So you come into that game understanding more of the world than anyone else, yet it scares the hell out of you because you know what you shouldn't know, and that stuff's coming in. I had a couple of really good game masters. I've never game mastered it myself, who did a really good job of kind of making you feel like you're a badass, but you're completely outgunned and there's nothing you can do about it except just try to survive. So that was a lot of fun. So that's kind of my experience with kind of running horror. Okay. Yeah, I never really got a chance to use games the systems that were aligned to that. So we didn't have like sanity and fear and all that kind of stuff. We just tried to role play it out at the time.
And the other big one, I guess, that I failed to mention, and I guess was I ran campaigns in this setting for years, was Ravenloft. It was the official Dungeons and Dragons kind of gothic horror setting that incorporated Strahd and incorporated the realms of the dread and things like that, and I had a ball running. But I guess it's funny because I was doing all of this all at the same time. I was running Cthulhu, running Vampire, running Ravenloft, and so it all kind of merged into one style of role playing and one style of storytelling, which is kind of that existential horror that I just really adore. I really love running games in that way.
So I have a question that's not even on the outline that I just thought about, because I'm in a game currently that is undead heavy. But again, I would not consider that a horror game. What would you say is the main kind of difference between like horror elements in a game and like an actual horror game? Or is there a difference? I don't know, James, because you were just talking. Oh, Carl.
I kind of look at it more I think elements of horror in a non-horror game. So if it's not a specific horror game, but there are elements of horror, I actually think that there isn't much of a difference, because in a lot of the way that I look at it, it's about the scene that it depicts the horror. I mean, you can ignore the horror, the feel of horror within a game, and have waves of undead, and you're just fighting the ghouls, and nothing seems untoward. But if you start to look at some of the themes and feel and mood of horror, and you start pointing out the humanity of these creatures and the undeadness of them and the rank smells, and you start to get into the body horror of the squishy bones as you kind of pulverize them, or the body fluids that leak out of them, you can inject horror elements into what wouldn't be a horror game. You can kind of have these strange feelings and strange little cut scenes within a non-horror game. Use of ghosts, for example, is a great example, where you could have a ghost in a non-horror game, but it's how you play that ghost and the mood that you set in that ghostly interaction that can kind of bring an element of horror even into a non-horror game. Does that kind of explain it?
I see. It's interesting is I think of it as like the aliens thing, right? Yeah. When you're talking about Alien, it's horror. I mean, it's that kind of thing. But then you go to Aliens, and it's the same creature, but it's more action. We're attacking. We're not afraid. We kind of know we're scared in the sense that we think we're going to get killed. Yeah. So that's how I think of the difference, right? If you've got a game where I'm a cleric and I'm rolling into hordes of zombies, and oh well, no big deal, I'm the big damn hero. It's just that different feeling from, like James, you were saying, the smells, the sights, the sounds, you yourself is not the big bad. The other stuff is the big bads, and you're trying to survive it. Yeah, that feeling.
So often it's the scariest thing is the unknown, and I think that's what you guys are also kind of painting here, is that to put in that mystery of what you're actually facing, and also maybe a feel of helplessness too, right? Of or just overwhelming things. Okay, but let's go on to I think one of the most.
That's right, because I mean, to go back to Carl's idea of Alien and Aliens, Aliens is a very different movie, and you've got it's action heavy and it's really pulpy. Until you're that little girl in the sewer with the doll's head, alone, away from everyone, and unable to kind of fend for yourself, then you're back into that horror mode, that helplessness, that kind of that fear.
But it's a scene, right?
Really
it's not the whole movie.
Great.
I think that's what we're talking about, the whole movie here of campaigns. So let's talk about that. You want to do a horror game. I think one of the most important things here is to then, is to really, like we've talked about a million times, session zero and kind of setting expectations with players. And, I think with horror, there probably is a bigger responsibility here because you are dealing maybe with some scary things. So let's talk about that, Carl. Like how do you set expectations with players, both to get them to kind of understand the mood that you're going for and also to kind of make sure everybody's on the same page as far as what people's limits are and stuff? What do you do?
Well, it's a little bit of different conversation from your standard I'm getting a game ready, because you are asking the players to go outside of their comfort zone. You're asking them to, even though they have complete, utter player agency, that to do things in a way to you're not going to be a big damn hero. You're going to have uneasy moments. Are you okay with that? How do you, can you work with me as a game master to build that mood? We're not going to be doing Monty Python jokes. We're not going to be, it's a tougher conversation in the sense of there's more to it there. And let's be honest, horror creates that a visceral feeling. And so it could definitely trigger players, when they get into it, trigger them, make them feel very bad about things, and you need to be able to provide an outlet of that. And I think, James, you'll walk through that a little bit more, but it's not just session zero. It's we are going for a feeling that we may not be used to having, right? This is something that is going to make you feel uneasy. Are you okay with that? It's going to maybe make you a little freaked out. Are you okay with that? There's going to be sights and sounds that are different. Are you okay with that? And then you really got to set that expectation, because the first game, people come and they start cracking Monty Python jokes. It's kind of over already.
Interesting.
And not that I have any problem with Monty Python jokes, but it's really, really important that the characters buy in, the players buy into what their characters are going to be doing.
So would you say that compared to almost like any other genre, horror is almost one of the most important ones to really be explicit about what your expectation should be and kind of what the mood is going to be, all those things? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think you summarized that very well. Okay. There's a bit higher bar of getting buy-in and having everybody on the same page than maybe some of the other genres where, you can roll into pulp and out of pulp and back and forth. But, once the horror's been broken or the sense has been broken, it's tougher to get back.
Interesting.
But it can be, and it's also more intense. So, it's much more intense to the players, and you have to give them outs during the game as well.
Well, let's talk about outs, James. I think what I remember from your playing, like you're very good about this, and you're very kind of on top of the mechanics. So how do you do it? How do you set up the outs? How do you set up the kind of like trigger whatever?
Yeah, I mean, just Carl put that perfectly. By the way, I think really good way of dealing with it. I'm not dealing with it, but acknowledging horror at the beginning and being really upfront and honest about how this is going to play out. I use a couple of very specific tools. I use an X card when we're playing in person, which is literally a card with an X on it, and people can just subtly touch it if things are getting a little bit out of control, and I will pull back on description and the viscera of kind of my horror, the way that I describe things. In online games, I use can we pause a second? So anyone on the table can just say, hey, can we just pause a second? And it just gives me an indication that we might be getting to the point where someone's actually uncomfortable. Because I think there is a tendency when you're running a horror game and you want to scare people and you want to make them uncomfortable, that you go as hard as you go, and often people might not have the same level of sensibility as you do as a storyteller. And so it's really important that when you're running a game that deals with horror and deals with adult themes like this, that you are very cognizant of other people's comfort and kind of manage it very well. And that, in some ways, that involves a couple of things. I actually do check-ins before any session where I think that there's going to actually be a significant thing. So not just session 0, but if I know that we're coming into a scene that might be some quite confrontational horror, body horror, or anything like that, I will actually touch base again with my players, saying, "Hey, look, this episode actually has some pretty significant issues with it in terms of, this could be particularly horrific in the way that we're going to be describing things. Again, just want to remind you that you can pull it back at any time." And in the similar vein as after the session, I'll often do a touch base with players as well to say, "Hey, look, that was pretty full on. If you need to give me any feedback on that, or if anything makes you uncomfortable, I'm happy to talk about it." Because the key is once you're in the session, it's all great, but you still actually have to kind of touch base and think about player welfare. I also use a formal RPG themes checklist before I start any of my horror games, which talk through what makes people uncomfortable. So give people the opportunity to say, actually, I don't want to experience close spaces, suffocation. I don't want body horror. I don't want torture. I don't want elements like this in these games. And then you just have to respect that those are the decisions that the group needs to make. So it's a fine line to do it right. But if you set it up right and set up the expectation really, really well, then and touch base with it the whole time. This isn't a set once and go, well, we did that, so don't worry about it. This is something that you should do as the game unfolds to make sure everyone is very comfortable. I had a rather tragic thing happen a couple of years ago where one of my players lost a family member in the middle of a campaign. It was in the middle of Ravenloft. It was in the middle of Curse of Strahd. And there are lots of themes about loss and death and undead and things like that. And so, it was just a reminder that you have to kind of be sensitive to people and their situation and touch base with them and make sure they're comfortable moving forward. I guess it's just, be a nice storyteller.
Really. Seems like quite the balancing act of, respecting everybody's differences, but also you want to push that envelope, right? You want, because that's what you're there to do. Yeah. You're there to set this, get these reactions. So on that note, I think, again, one of the most important things for a horror game is the mood. So how do you go about really setting the mood, setting the ambiance? And especially, I can imagine both of you guys doing cons, right? And you can go really heavy with that. And we've talked about that before. But yeah, in all different levels, how do you set the mood? We'll start with you, James.
Mood I love. And even in conventions, I tend to go a little bit over the top with mood. But in particular, I think horror actually works very, very well. And I think it works much better as a face-to-face storytelling rather than an online version. I run Call of Cthulhu and I run games online, but I actually find that you set the mood a lot better if you're running face-to-face. I use mood lighting wherever I can. I try and avoid running horror games during the day. I actually think the darkness and the shadows and the more intimate, closed-in feel make it a much better game. I use soundtracks, and we've already talked about my love of Sirenscape. But Sirenscape run a huge bevy of horror soundscapes, and so you can kind of have that creaking floorboards, that kind of discordant droning sound that just puts people on edge, just to allow for some of that stuff. Handouts are really important, blood spattered pieces of paper and the evil foul kind of idol and things like that also work very well. But in my mind, the best way of setting mood ever, in this is my little trick about setting mood, it's all about voice and It's all about quiet. So it's actually about bringing your voice down so that people not necessarily are straining to hear you, but it's about delivering a lot of what you do in a soft way, a soft, measured, slow horror way. And in my mind, that works so well in setting mood. If you can set the mood in that kind of precise, quiet, bone-chilling increment of just quiet menace, I think you'll find that you'll go a long way to setting a mood right. And you'll cut down a lot of those Monty Python jokes because people will feel that discomfort already and be kind of nervous to break the tension, I guess. So in a lot of ways, mood, as opposed to props and bits and pieces, a lot of it's about the way that you actually sell it as a dungeon master.
Carl, what about you?
James nailed it. For me, I don't do very much in person, like in the house kind of thing. I do conventions, and conventions it's difficult to do candlelight or soundtracks or that sort of thing. But the gate of your voice, how you present information, is just absolutely critical. When I'm running my campaigns with you guys, it's very much, we're talking fast and we're doing stuff. In a horror game, you have to set that things aren't the way you expect them to be. And that's incredibly important. And it's hard at a convention when there's a lot of noise because you can't get as quiet as you'd like to. And so one of the things I like to do is I move around the table a lot. So one thing that's kind of nice is to get close to the people who you're talking to. You come across, go, oh, God. So you're in the stateroom by yourself? Is that true?
So invade physical space. Got it. Yeah.
Not too close. No, I'm not saying that I'm about to kiss him on the cheek or anything. No,
but you're riding that line of what makes people uncomfortable a little bit and just kind of throwing them off in their normal way they communicate. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. But otherwise, James just nailed it. That all that comes together and really sets the mood for the game, for sure.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's talk about some of the kind of mechanical conventions that you do to kind of make horror. Like, Carl, what are some of the things that you do, more mechanically? I guess it doesn't have to be specific, but like, how do you adjust your games when it's like, oh, we're doing fantasy, but now we're doing horror, right? What do you do, like, kind of mechanically to set that up?
Well, the first thing is I spend time kind of decreasing the power level. The whole point is to make the characters feel a little helpless. Yeah, they're not they're not Indiana Jones running through everything. They're the sidekick who's needs to be a little bit afraid. So sometimes it's everyman. Sometimes it's just decreasing the power level. So again, I play Savage Worlds a lot. So in Savage Worlds, you can minimize the bennies you can have. You can take away edges and not allow folks to have edges as a everyday normal person. You can decrease the amount of wounds they can take or make it so they can't soak damage. So there's things mechanically that makes the person a little more helpless, a little more prone to I guess, being affected by this horror that they're going against. Let's say the monster of the week, if they don't feel like, I can just stand toe to toe with them, because they can't.
Yeah. You've lost it,
and they don't have all the resources, right? They don't have all the same resources they would normally. So,
absolutely, and it's important to I think it's important to set an expectation here too, that with your players, to understand the lethality of the game. When I run horror games, it's really important to explain, hey, look, you're probably not going to survive this, by the way. The idea of everyone kind of surviving and living a happily ever after is shouldn't be the expectation of these games. The expectation should be that if we survive, it's there, but it's from a complete fluke that we got out of this alive, and you will watch some of your friends not survive this. I think is a really important thing. I run a rule in conventions, but also in my games, that when somebody dies in one of my horror games, they get a standing ovation at the table, so that it makes people feel like, I actually achieved what the game was set out to achieve, which is a memorable, iconic way of dying in a spectacular fashion, and it takes the edge off of that having to survive every encounter. Because I think one of the biggest traps you have in a horror role-playing game is people still have that I'm going to survive this at all costs kind of mentality that you might have from a fantasy role-playing game, where really half the fun is not surviving in some ways in doing this kind of stuff. So this idea of decreasing the power level of your character, or more importantly, increasing the power of the adversary, so that the likelihood of your survival is actually quite low, is really important. If I look at a game like Curse of Strahd, where setting up the expectation that you will not survive Strahd is a very important one for that game, because you have multiple encounters with this big bad evil guy in the middle throughout the course of the campaign. And if you felt like you could take him early, the game would be over very, very quickly. It has to be a process of developing up knowledge and understanding of what the true foe is and how you can actually defeat them. If you go straight into the toe-to-toe idea, you just won't survive it in a lot of ways. And I think that everyman idea, that low survivability, actually improves the way that you role play. I mean, everyone's seen a horror film. Everyone understands the kind of idea of not being of what happens when the match goes out and you're plunged into darkness and the evil creatures no longer are afraid of the light. Everyone understands that kind of idea, and so the role playing of that helplessness, I think, is what makes horror role playing so much fun.
Cool. So let's talk about more like narratively. What are kind of some of the tips and tricks that you would use, James, when, again, to differentiate between a normal fantasy game? What are the narrative kind of conventions that you use to make it really feel like horror?
There's a couple of things that I use a lot, and a lot of it's about the individualistic nature of horror and getting into the boots of what it feels like to be around all these horrible things that are going wrong with you. And in some ways, there's a little bit of a trap here in that when you're running horror games, you can get caught up a little bit. And I actually think this isn't a bad thing, by the way. Horror games, by their nature, can sometimes lessen players' agency. Mm-hmm. You can kind of take agency off players a little bit, because a lot of what I do narratively is about describing how people feel and put words into their mouths and put words into their minds about how they're feeling in a certain situation. And normally that's a bit of a no-no when you're running role-playing games. It's up to the player to determine how they feel. It's up to you to give them the scenario and they react. A lot of when you're running a plot line and a narration in terms of horror games, you're actually provoking feeling with a lot of what you do. And so the idea of you feel afraid, you might say as a dungeon master or a games master, that normally you would never do that. Normally they're heroic. So it's about getting into the mindset of the players is a lot of what I do and how I work through that. So I'll often talk about your heart starting to beat loudly in your chest, the hairs sticking up on your hands, you feel the sweat start to furrow on your brow, and you're overcome by this overwhelming urge to flee. That for the others, you see this person and the colour is drained out of his face. They have seen a ghost and they are panicked. And that's often not how you run a role-playing game, right? Because that's up to the players to decide how they do that. So in some ways, that's kind of a big shift and a big change in how I run games and how I run horror games.
It's almost like you're like, I'm the lizard, you're lizard brain, your character's lizard brain, and you are reacting this way because of forces unseen. And I think that's really right.
Yep.
We're like, normally if it's, the player has agency, but in this case, like, you're like, no, this is what's happening. This is the experience, because we're not living in like a VR, right? So it's almost hard to really set that up. But yeah, that's really interesting, James. Carl, what?
and it's set up to the player how they react.
Of course,
So I'm overcome with fear, but I just grab my gun and I shoot wildly, or I run screaming down the hallway, or I cower in a certain. It's up to them how they react to it. But you just kind of have to overwhelm the players with their feelings,
because fear is the inevitability of what's happening, and then then they have the choice on how they act upon that fear. That I really do like that. Carl, what about you? What are some of kind of the narrative tricks that you do to really set the mood for?
Well, I think one of the big things is be very I'll use the term vivid in your descriptions and how you explain the scene with all the pardon I don't know if it's a pun, but pardon the use of the phrase gory details, all the gory details that are there. So, like, for example, I was in a Delta Green game, and there was a barn, and the barn had, some ritualistic killings going on, and the description could very easily, you come into the barn, you see blood stains on the floor, you see, this disturbance, blah, blah, blah. But if you got into it and you really started saying, things like, you see the drips slowly coming off of the board where the horse once lived, and the hay is sticky under your feet as you crawl across the way towards this. Just that kind of thing makes all the difference. And I kind of came up with an example halfway on the spot, so it's not quite as cool as it could be. But that's the point. You'd be very vivid in the smells and And then that kind of helps then if you do start adding in, well, this, that whiff of smell kind of makes you nauseated. And normally the player would say, hey, I get to choose that. But now we're back to where James is saying you're taking a little bit of that agency because you're giving that vivid description of sights, sounds, smells, and in that way that we talked about from setting the mood, in that voice that's kind of just drawing them in to the best of your ability. I think that's one of the biggest things that changes from, a hallway is just a hallway. No, it's not a hallway in a horror genre. It's a dark thing that goes off into the distance with the dripping water and all that kind of stuff going on. And you have to be very, very clear to do that. I think that's my opinion on helping that out. So.
Any other? Yeah.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Those details are important, and that there's fear, and the other element of horror is also that revulsion where you just go, oh God, that's grotesque, And in order to make people revolted, you actually have to describe it to the point where they're revolted, which unfortunately, you're painting pretty awful pictures is kind of where you go down in that area. But you can have damn good fun doing it. Watching the actual revulsion in your players is always a fun thing when you're turning stomachs across the table. A bit of it about the other element about in terms of when we're putting a game like this together is there is an element of pacing as well. I think what Carl and I have been talking a lot about is about these slow burns, where you're slowly introducing these clues and you're slowly building the dread and the fear, and you're slowly painting a picture of things are not right in this world and things are looking very, we're not in Kansas anymore. This is really macabre and it's really out there. But the other side of pacing, in my mind, is the jump scare, where you can then intersperse that with the actual reveal of something that is truly horrific, and that's when you can change the pacing of your voice and change the pacing of a scene to really unveil and very quickly. And in some ways, in a horror game, that's the important point. That's the important part to make, where it is the slow exploration that goes into the hurried panic and the fleeing and the screaming and the running away. You have to have that snap where you can kind of draw people's attention to the scene and then change the pace very quickly into the action sequence where they're firing their guns everywhere and things are going horribly awry and people are running screaming down the hallway. I think that's the other side of narratively how you set one of these games up. You've got to intersperse them both. The slow burn and then the fast panic is kind of the two dials that you end up using a lot when you're running these games.
Like just keeping people unbalanced, keeping them not used to whatever rhythms they're used to being, kind of disrupting that. And do you ever telegraph? I mean, because so much of what we've talked about before many times is telegraphing story beats or, informing the players of kind of where you're going because of things. But it seems like with horror, at least what I'm getting from you guys, especially with kind of that disruption and jump scares, is you really don't want to inform them at times, right? There is times when you're building that tension, right? But, forgive me if I'm wrong, but for the jump scares, you don't want to kind of set that up where they're going to expect anything, right? You have to be kind of sneaky about it. Is that something that you find yourself doing or not?
Yeah, you do. Yeah, and sometimes you have to throw the jump scare in when they least expect it, which is the hard part. It's the hard part about the pacing. The telegraphing is a really interesting thing because you have to telegraph the dread and the evil in order to build the tension and build the fear. But in that requires a buy-in from your players, because if you say that the room ahead it was an old playground and the rusted swings are kind of here, and then you can get an overwhelming smell of iron, of blood coming from this, and you kind of build up the tension. The worst thing that can happen is the players go, nope, not doing that. I'm closing the door. I'm going home and I'm putting the kettle on and I'm going to bed. You have to have buy-in from the players that as you're telegraphing these horrific things that they're seeing, they still continue to step forward into the unknown. And that's the hard bit, because you're telegraphing and the players have to kind of acknowledge, yeah, this is bad, but we're continuing anyway. It's the whole thing where you're yelling at a horror movie going, what are you doing? Don't go in the basement. You're an idiot. But when you role play and when you're in these games, you better damn well go into that basement or the game's not going anywhere.
Is part of it you have to have a good hook too? why would these, like, you have to have that compelling reason for people to be doing the things that normal, sane people wouldn't be doing. Is that something that you find yourself also kind of really having a solid hook?
Well,
Carl? Yeah.
Well, part of it's hook, and part of it is also, players buying into doing what the expectation, following the tropes, right?
Yeah.
But also, as a game master, you can do things to kind of force that. Don't give them a choice, right? I mean, in the sense of, don't put them in a situation where they do not have the ability to take other avenues.
Yeah.
For example, like you're isolating them from outside help. From how many horror movies are in like a building or in some place that you can't escape from, when all the windows have bars on them and all. So the point is, make it so they can't just say nope out when they want to. And for example, in Savage Worlds, there's a setting called ETU, East Texas University, which is a very horror-based one. And you could have adventures on campus taking place in campus housing where people can run around, or you could have adventures that take place in the sub-basement where something's happening where there's really only one way out, and you're still trying to explore. So I think that's where, James was saying, they got to make the choice to go in the basement, or there's not much other choice than to be in the basement, and then they have to work through that. So that's one of the things that I think is also something you can do to help the story along. But to James' point, the players have to already bought in at session 0. There's going to be danger. You're supposed to go towards it. It's just like any other role-playing game, right? There's danger, and if the hero doesn't go towards it, then there's no game, right? Because then we're all sitting in Hobbit Town smoking our weed and just hanging out, right? So pipe weed, that is.
Which is what? So weed. But yeah, I definitely see that. Of course, you have to buy in, and there's that yes and with improv. But I do think that, like, I mean, in this case, it really does seem like railroading, which is such a dirty word, right? But often that probably seems like the best vehicle to really deliver people, is to have that kind of direct track of why there's times where they might have a choice, right? You really want to kind of lock them down into, like, feels like it's their only course, right? That or death. I mean, you said there was only one way out, but there's 2 ways out, right? They could give in to the monster.
And yes, they're a little railroaded, but I mean, it's the point where you got to that situation that shouldn't be railroaded. There's plenty of opportunities to come at all of these games from different angles. But once you enter the basement, you're in the basement. It's like and if they hear the latch of the basement door suddenly lock behind them and realize that they're trapped, well, now we're in the horror. Now we're in that kind of, you're down there alone by yourself. The other trope that you should lean into in some ways, both as a player and as a storyteller, it's this idea of isolation. I mean, isolation is a huge theme in horror. It's that one person against all overwhelming odds, and when you're caught alone, you're in real trouble. Which goes completely against the trope of never split the party, right? But whenever I play a Call of Cthulhu game, I always say, unless you split the party, there's no chance of having fun, because the bad guys are going to pick you off one at a time. If you're all in the same room together, huddling around the torch, you've got to go off and explore by yourself in order to really discover where the horror is. And that makes it an interesting thing, because you're exposing yourself. You're kind of saying, all right, I'm putting myself at risk, but without the risk, the horror, it's if everything's nice and safe and clean and lit, you're not really running a horror game. You're running something entirely different.
Let's actually talk about that point a little bit more, because I think that is very interesting and kind of unique to horror, is splitting the party. Like, is there any other tricks to really get the party to split? Like, do you have things like, well, the time's running out, so the only possible way you can do X is if you guys split up. Do you have any other tips like that? Because I think that it does seem like it's all pretty unique to horror games.
Spatial is also part of it. Is if there's knowledge to be gained that's far enough apart. That's why somebody's got to go to the library. Somebody's got to go to the catacombs. Somebody's got to go, because we're not going room to room to room as a group, right? We need to split up, because what we need to do is located disparately, and the time aspect of it. We don't have time to spend an hour here and then go spend an hour across town and then we really have to split to be able to do everything we need to do. And that comes to, I think in like Delta Green, you always have, and some other games you have specialties, and there's someone who's going to go to the library anyway because that's what they do and that's their thing. So I think that's part of it as well.
Okay.
You can also split the party in a room too, which is there's a little nuanced trick where you describe. You start broadly, this room looks like this and all this kind of stuff. And as people start to say, I want to do this, I want to invest, I want to have a look at the bookshelf, I want to look at the window, I want to look at whatever. You can just focus on an individual player and then take what they're doing to an extent to kind of isolate them from the group. So, well, actually, as you approach that window, you and only you hear the sound of muffled screams from the other side. Well, I open up the window. Oh, okay. You find yourself, you hear even closer and you feel your heart panic as you hear the sound of someone calling your name. Well, I get out the window. But what you don't do is throw to the rest of the party. You just focus your energy on that one person's decision making, and soon enough you'll find that they'll isolate themselves within the narration. And you can often say, "Oh, hang on, the rest of you don't hear this. This is just this person," and you can put a lot of attention into one person just to isolate them until they get themselves in that area. Same thing when you're the one poking at the blood, or you're the one opening the eldritch tome, or you're the one that's confronting the horror. You can kind of isolate within a scene that has other players in it.
Interesting. Kind of manipulating perception.
So that kind of breaks the. So that kind of breaks the whole concept of sharing the spotlight a little bit, right? You focus a little bit longer. You linger a little bit longer on one player than maybe you might normally if you're sharing the spotlight and going around the table. You just linger on them long enough for something to happen. That makes a lot of sense.
Or to maybe even
and it becomes personable too. So if you can one-on-one describe how someone's feeling and the viscera, and they feel like they're experiencing that alone, that gives a horror feel to it, because it's not necessarily the whole group experiencing that kind of vibe, even though everyone's hearing it at the table and they're all smiling kind of at the poor sucker that's having to do this. It isn't a shared experience.
It still seems like they might, like both in characters and out of character, kind of question, is this really happening? Or are they like having some type of mental or something, right? Like that's kind of that feeling too of like questioning this person. Very, very cool. Very, very intense. Let's talk about one of the most primal aspects of horror, I think, and kind of the one that dates back to our, birth as a sapient species, is kind of the dark forest, is the expansiveness of empty space. Well, let's talk about the unknown. I think that is that's the one that we can most, right? We're all afraid of the dark and what was under our bed as a kid because we just didn't know what was in there. So how do you summon the unknown? What are the ways that you do to really manifest that in players? James, I'll start with you.
Well, this is a huge theme in Lovecraftian literature. It's all about that. There's a quote, I'll never remember this entirely, but the idea being that if the human mind could correlate the enormity of what was happening in the universe, their mind would surely break with the horror of the extremity of it, and the fact that the universe is inhabited by deeply unknowable malevolent forces that are there to kill you. The unknowable is a really interesting one, because you have to describe something in order for people to get to be fearful, but you have to leave enough doubt and without really understanding what it is that you're fighting in order to create the unease and the strangeness of it, to really invoke what you were just saying. Am I really seeing this, or am I imagining it? Which is another part of the horror. And so the idea of not describing things fully, not showing, so that it's one of these tragedies. When I play Call of Cthulhu, there's so much wonderful art of Call of Cthulhu, of the evil monsters, and yet one of the worst things you can do is kind of show the monster. The worst thing you can do in a Call of Cthulhu game is plop a mini on the table, because then it turns into a tactical, I get this side, I get that side. Instead, I use very loose terms. And you glimpse things from weird angles. You see the shadows of creatures before you see their real form. You see what they have done rather than what they are, and really play up that kind of, this could be a large bat or it could be a large octopus. So you're not quite sure. All you can see is 1,000 arms stretching towards you and the cacophony of 1,000 voices calling you to your doom. You haven't really described anything. All you've described is kind of the initial reactions to what they might see, or their first kind of impression of what it is that they're seeing, rather than actual getting into the tactile elements and the creature is 5 foot wide by 4 foot tall and has 4 eyes, kind of thing. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Carl, what about you?
I think that's the most. Well, that's the two most important things that I look at, and so this is not cosmic horror, but more kind of the gothic or the action. Is the two big things are you glimpse it or you see the results of it. You never see it at all until maybe this jump cut. Or the shock that James was talking about earlier. It's always, you see the results of what this thing can do. The blood stains, somebody tried to battle it. And so there's a little piece of it and it's, unknowable what it is. You don't understand. And it's just, it's just a horror of what it did, but I've never seen it, or I just get a glimpse of it. Like there's so many creatures like in D&D that are so cool that if you just saw a little bit of it, just that, like you said, there's a tentacle, but what's behind the tentacle? I swear I saw something under that grate. It came up and it reached for me, but I couldn't tell what it was, but it was under the grate and didn't have a clown nose. So it's scaring me. And it's just a glimpse of it until the time comes to go from the slow burn to the shock. And then things are there, and you're face to face now with the horror that's been building up. So I think those are a couple of things that I don't play a lot of Call of Cthulhu, so I'm really thinking about that gothic action monster of the week sort of thing. And the longer you hide it, the scarier it is, because people's minds will build out a scarier monster than it is in reality.
I was just about to say that that we talk about so much of using players as a resource, and this seems like you're really going to leverage their own imaginations to make it scarier than you even intended to. So that's really cool. I think
and you can play with descriptions. Yeah. Like if you actually described a goblin in a horror way, you see this child. It couldn't be any more than 3 or 4 years old, but as you peer into the darkness, you see its sallow skin and it hasn't seen daylight. It must have been imprisoned beneath, in this basement for most of its natural life. Its eyes are a sickly, jaundiced yellow, and you see all that its teeth have been filed to sharp, pointy points. It's a goblin, but the way you describe it could be an entirely different thing, and I think that's half the fun of the horror. It's kind of it's keeping people off their toes, so they don't quite know what the hell's going on.
So I think that's a good place to end this too. Is that let's talk about where at least I know for sure in movies and TV shows, but also in games that are intense, which I have played. I think so much of the important parts is that times of rest, right, or times of safety, or times for humor. So let's talk about some of that, because I think that is one of the most important pieces. Because right, if you always have it up to 10 all the time, or always have them feeling bad, then it's almost like you become kind of more numb to that, right? So what do you do? How do you present breaks? How do you allow for humor, allow for those kind of things, Carl?
Well, I think it's just the pacing of the adventure, right? It like you said, there's ups and downs within the adventure. So you can have a scene that's very intense, and then one where it's more like they are in the library looking around at books and taking it easy, and maybe they're having some role play banter back and forth about, look what I've seen and this is weird or whatever. But you've brought the intensity down. They've got a chance to kind of regroup, get their energy back. And then they leave the library and now they're back kind of into the fray of things. And, the door slams behind them as they leave the library. And suddenly now they're again isolated once again, and you've ratcheted it up. But you give those moments in the pacing of the adventure where they don't have to be 100% on their toes at the, their heart rate at the maximum, they get a chance to take a breather. And then those are the times where kind of the gallows humor can come in, and there can be some, because even in war, right, people are making jokes with each other. So it's okay at that stage until you ratchet it back up again.
Yeah, I find I have perfect points, Carl. Like absolutely, all those work. I find I have a tendency in all my horror games to have my non-player characters a little bit goofier than you probably would normally have, to kind of provide that brevity, to provide that light-hearted humor. So they're either very cowardly, so everyone goes, "Ah, look at this coward," "Oh my God, I can't believe you're going in there," kind of over-the-top silliness. Or they're very heavily into the trope, so everyone goes, "Oh, I know exactly this guy," and they kind of have a bit of a laugh. If you think of, and yes, it's a very pulp movie, but if you think about something like The Mummy, where there is a lot of humor that goes on in between it, I try and intersperse that kind of level of energy, even in my real heavy horror games, because it allows for that kind of light and dark, so that the dark becomes even more horrific. But when they're back in town at the saloon, they get to have these little interactions. I think it's important to intersperse them in there so that they get the silly as well as the horror. It's not quite. What's the name of the movie with the mask and the slasher? It's not quite the Scream kind of side of ridiculousness, of silliness and horror, but it's that kind of vibe that you kind of break the dark with a bit of light.
Yeah, no, it just really seems like, because when you don't have the light, like, you can't judge how dark darkness is, right? Yeah. Very cool. So I think, let's talk just about final thoughts. What are your kind of, after everything we've talked about, what are your final thoughts, James?
Final thoughts is have a go. I really love horror games, and I think they're actually really, really well suited to one-shots. So if you're thinking about running a horror game, have a bit of a look at it. Ravenloft's Guide for Dungeons and Dragons has some one-shots in it. The Chaosium has a whole heap of really good Call of Cthulhu one-shots. Coming in, it's a long way off now, but if you're coming towards Halloween and you want to try something different, do a little Halloween one-shot, a 1 or 2 hour kind of horror game, just to give it a go, and see how you go. I think it's a great genre. I think it's really well suited to role-playing, because it's so well entrenched in people's minds because of horror films. They understand the genre, so it's easy to kind of get stuck into it. But I love it, so have a go at it.
Carl?
Oh, and I'll just reiterate a couple of points. Get that buy-in with the players, understand where their lines and veils are, that they want to make sure that you're not keep pushing, set that mood, and then really put the players in a place where they're uncomfortable, the descriptions are uncomfortable, they're isolated, and just make them uneasy. That's the whole point of horror, is to make everybody feel a little bit uneasy afraid and uneasy. So, well, great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and I hope you got something out of it. Remember to drop by masteringtherepg.com to learn about our other projects, and contact and support us. Please email gamemaster@masteringtherepg.com if you've got questions, need advice, want some questions adjudicated. We're also on Twitter at masteringtherepg. If you like the show, please help us with a positive review. And send us some comments. We'd just love to hear from you. So once again, this is Carl, Eric, and James saying goodbye, and say goodbye, guys.
Goodbye, guys.
Spooky gaming.